Sippy. Hi everyone, Sweet-Thany Meat Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for a review of the new Horrendous album, Idol. This is the fourth full-length album from American death metal band Horrendous, making their Season of Mist debut. Maybe you haven't heard of these guys before, but they have been together as a group for 10 years now, so they are nothing entirely new. Their past 3 albums were released right under my nose. This ass-kicking band existed the whole time, and I didn't even know. And while Horrendous fits pretty squarely into the death metal genre, they're a pretty versatile group, with previous albums taking on more of a heavy metal or a thrash metal style. Melodic death metal is also a sound they've dabbled in here and there. Meanwhile, their debut is actually a very meat and potatoes death metal album, from the buzzsaw guitars to the guttural, growled vocals. I mean, pretty much a standard death metal album. In comparison with their newest LP, they sound like a totally transformed band. Yes, still a death metal band, but if you told me that these 2 albums were made by the same group, just based off of a blind taste test, I'd have a hard time believing you. So Horrendous has undergone quite an evolution since their debut LP, to the point where comparing the sound of their earlier albums to now is almost apples and oranges. Though going back into their discography, each Horrendous album up until this point is pretty good in its own right. However, Idol, in my opinion, is a serious achievement for the band. A band that sounds like their skills and their creativity are improving greatly with each new record. And it's kind of ironic that this album sees the band diving deeply into a more technical death metal sound, which usually is not my cup of tea. A subgenre of death metal I am very picky with, because if it's too clean, it's too predictable, it feels too robotic and perfectly produced, it's an instant turnoff. It's a no from me, dog. Though this decade so far has not been without some great tech death releases, from Gorguts or Dying Fetus, also Beyond Creation and the first Artificial Brain album. I'm into a little Obscura and Ulcerate, but I can only really take so much of their material at a time. But this new Horrendous album quickly became one of my favorite tech death releases of the decade, and it's so fun, it's so quick, it's so thrilling to listen to. There's a lot of tight and flashy playing all over this record with a nice, human touch, aggressive performances. The guitars are played like these guys are frickin' animals. The drums just get beat to death on this record too. And the guitar passages, while technical in spirit, are also really catchy. Lots of dark, sticky melodies coming out of these guitars. Also, tons of fretless bass, with a tone that really pops out in the mix. It's rare that you hear bass standing out in this particular genre of death metal, or really in death metal at all, which I guess is a big similarity between this record and some of the other tech death albums I mentioned earlier. The Gorguts record has some pretty strong bass lines on it. Beyond Creation is also known for their use of fretless bass, but I think Horrendous's application of it as well is pretty sharp and creative. A lot of the tracks on this album are multifaceted, intricately written, great flow from segment to segment to segment, and some animalistic vocals. Great vocals on this thing. Not the typical guttural growls that you'll catch on a lot of death metal albums or Horrendous's first album. I liken the singing or the screaming on this album to be more like that of, I don't know, a strained, angry werewolf, or like the vocals on a Weakling album, let's say. If you've heard the band Weakling before, if you haven't, please listen to Weakling. Although it also depends on the track you're listening to as well, because occasionally the band does work in some campy, clean vocals to liven a track up or add some variety, add some harmony, like on the closing track or on Divine Anhedonia, which also comes complete with these creepy Vincent Price-esque spoken word vocal passages, which are kind of weird. I love them though. They certainly send shivers up my spine. Also some very eerie, clean vocal harmonies on Soothsayer that I think are pretty great too. Even though some of the clean vocals on the second leg of the song Devotion I found to be pretty awkward, I think a lot of the smoother singing on this record adds a lot of flavor to the album. Another thing to note is this album is 40 minutes long and 8 tracks in length, so it's pretty straightforward, pretty punchy. Not a death metal album with a whole lot of room for error, and the band certainly seems aware of that, as this is a very no BS release with very little in terms of flab on it. There's a dramatic little intro cut on the album, a short instrumental threnody just before the last cut of the album. So essentially there are 6 core songs on this record that rip from front to back, each of which seems meticulously assembled, as the band just doesn't really put a single lull anywhere into any of these songs. It's so goddamn watertight. It's relentless mayhem. And when I say that, I don't mean it just sounds like the band is just endlessly beating the crap out of their instruments, because there is certainly a method to the madness, because there seems to be a lot of forethought going into every riff, every note, every drum beat, every transition. They're not just letting it rip on a jam, they are playing through very aggressively and very fluidly these intricate little tech death ragers. The Idolater, for example, kicks off with a very nice, open, spacey, ominous intro. Some sparkly guitar arpeggios shimmer very nicely against some expressive bass soloing. Then the band explodes into the main theme riff with some really expressive drums. They hit this groove at full speed in the main section of the song where they kind of bring out like a thrash metal flavor for a second. Later, some really interesting chord phrasings, as well as mathematical guitar leads. Also love the way the track fills out with these harmonious background vocals. Again, this is one of many tracks on the album that works in multiple phases, but each phase really keeps the momentum high. As for track after track after track, the band hits great grooves. They build up fantastic tension. They break out into these surprise passages that either slow things down or present a new idea entirely. I mean, some of my biggest gripes with the tracks on this album is that I wish they were longer. Like the track Divine Anhedonia that I mentioned earlier, the cut is 5 minutes and there is so much packed into it. It feels almost half that length. And again, I just love how the band can throw so much into a song, throw 3 songs worth of ideas into one song, and yet it all sticks out. It's all processing really cleanly. It's not like just a bunch of random crap to disorient the listener to make them feel like they're hearing something really interesting. The song Devotion is another highlight on this album for me, though nearly every track on here is. It kicks off with one of the most badass, throttling riffs of the entire record. It's one of the few moments on this album that not only reminds me of some of the other tech death bands I mentioned earlier, but also the technical thrash outfit Vector, which, believe me, that is not a bad comparison to get. That is not bad company to keep. The closing track, also a highlight, is an 8-minute monster, and the band really does save the best for last. And while 8 minutes is not the longest metal song in the world, they pack so much into this song that it becomes an explosion of color. Yeah, I'm just so highly impressed with this album. I'm just loving it, and yet I'm also starved. I just want more. I would love to hear the band get more ambitious with how all of these tracks come together as an overall idea or a concept here, a bit more interesting flow in between these songs, but as is, this is a really great release. So much guts, so much focus on this record, so much raw energy, but also the maturity to hone it and focus it into these really creative compositions, as this album is not just visceral and physical, but it's also cerebral. It's very much a head game too. This thing is just wall-to-wall fantastic writing, production, performances. Definitely one of the best death metal releases I've heard this year. I'm feeling a light to decent 9 on this thing. Transition, have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe, and please don't die. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Horrendous, Idol, forever.